Welcome to the Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of non-believer who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have, so be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you. To start things off this episode, we wanted to get into a couple corrections. First of all, in the last one, we talked about what would be coming up next week. Well, we're not exactly going to be a weekly podcast. To start things off, we really aren't going to try to hit any specific schedule, but we'll probably have new things coming out every 2 to 3 weeks. So if you heard that and got real excited, huge apologies.
Sorry.
The other thing I wanted to bring up is that on the last episode, when we talked about religion, we really only talked about Christianity and a pretty basic Protestant version of it. And I just wanted to say that in this conversation, that is not sort of the only perspective that we're going to look at in contrast to non-belief. I'm a Jew, a secular Jew, so that's part of my tradition. I have a strange, confused history with the Mormon Church. So I just wanted to let people know that there are other perspectives we'll be examining as well. So getting into the first topic, which we talked about a little bit in the last episode.
Yeah, can't wait.
I wanted to talk about the description of the show, where we say that we are two atheist parents and why we chose that term, because there are certainly a lot of other different ways to describe non-belief. To start off, Pops, did you always call yourself an atheist?
Oh, gosh, no. I was a very devout Protestant growing up. And I mean, to the point where I would be heavily involved in the execution of church services as a teen, doing, acolyte, crucifer, that whole thing. I looked forward to the ritual of it. I enjoyed praying. I felt like I had a relationship with God. It was, I guess, the writer in me bubbled up to visualize me like fighting mano a mano, Satan himself rising up from the back of the church and me defending the entire congregation from his, beastly wiles. But I didn't necessarily have a difficult time leaving religion. It was just a long process for me. First, it was in going away to college, not having a weekly religious ritual. And then also in college, reading more about different perspectives, starting to appreciate myth-making vis-a-vis anthropology, and starting to understand more the perspective of the writers of the various books of the Bible. And then moving forward, starting to feel more of a connection with our physical understanding of the universe, and at which point I became more of a deist or like a panentheist. But the idea that there was like a presence that we could point to perhaps, but not really ever fully understand, that didn't have a direct daily interaction with us. So, gradually pulling away from the I have a direct personal connection with a thing to, a thing still exists, I believe, to where I discarded that, realizing that I didn't actually know. And then once I accepted the fact that I didn't actually know, I became an atheist, and whatever knowledge label you put on that, Gnostic, agnostic, hard, soft, whatever, I honestly don't care about labels as much. I mean, I used to when I initially deconverted. I was like, it verged on being a pedant, which, I now look back on with shame. But I was very specific about labels and got into like definitional arguments with people on the internet. And it was just a waste of time for me, at least. Some people might not consider it that. But once I left, I realized I was actually, agnostic as, an agnostic atheist. And that process took maybe like 3 decades.
Yeah. So I feel like my answer is super boring in comparison. We already mentioned the fact that I didn't grow up in a particularly religious household.
Right.
So half of my family is Jewish. We celebrated both holidays, but I wasn't taught that any one religion was the truth to be known. And I wish I could go back and get in my brain as a child, because I don't think I had any term for myself. Like, I truly don't think I identified as anything. And I grew up in a community that was pretty predominantly Jewish. Because of that, I feel like particularly Reformed Jews, they speak, faith is just like a totally different thing to Jews than it is to Christians. So the Jews that I know didn't, their religious experience was like not part of the conversation. So I didn't have to think that much about what other kids were thinking about this.
Right.
It wasn't until I went to a religious camp that was Christian.
Here we go.
I'm not going to get into the whole story.
Oh, boo.
But it was the first moment where I fully comprehended that there were people who truly had deep faith in a religion. And at the exact same moment, I realized I do not. and at that point, I felt like I cannot. Like, that is not how I am built, and that is never going to happen for me. So I went straight from being nothing to realizing that this word atheist applied to me.
Interesting.
And so it never occurred to me that there would be anything else to call myself. Later on, thinking about people who call themselves agnostic versus atheist, or sort of all the different terms, I never felt like there was a big need to change for 2 reasons. One, Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller, there's a lot I don't agree with him about, but he had this great discussion of agnostic versus atheist. And kind of like you said, that you could be both, that basically they answer different questions. Does a God exist? I don't know. Agnostic. Do I believe in a God? No. Atheist. So that made instant sense to me, and is how I always described it to people.
Right.
On the other hand, I feel like also these terms, in a lot of times they come up in conversation with other people about topics. And there again, I feel like atheist is a clearer answer, because though I'm not certain whether or not a God exists, most of the time that it comes up, I feel like people aren't asking, do you believe there's some kind of vague consciousness that helped create like the rules of physics? Like, that's usually not how it immediately comes up. It comes up in relation to major religions. And I do feel 99.9% sure that none of the major religions, at least how we practice or understand them today, is true. So again, in that way, atheist felt like the best, easy description that would let other people know where I stand in the world.
You know what makes it easier for somebody to understand where you stand in the world?
Asking them.
Oh my gosh, you read my mind. So I guess mind reading would be number 2. But yes, asking the questions. This is why I realized in one moment why definitional fights are so useless. Because at the end of the day, when a person gives themselves a label about what they believe or their worldview or whatever, within that, there is always going to be variation. And so it's ultimately better to just ask a person what they believe, because it could be that they are using a different usage of the label than you are. If you want to know what I believe about something, just go ahead and ask me, because then I'll tell you, and then we can have an actual substantive conversation. That's an actual conversation and not you straw manning me, because that's what it comes down to. Is is people that will disagree with you about these sort of big theological, philosophical concepts. Like a lot of times they are so invested ego-wise in being right that they don't want to ask you the questions, that it's just more comfortable to ask you something generic, have you reply generically, and they say, oh, well, if you're that, then you believe this, that, and the other thing, right? It's like I say I'm an atheist, all of a sudden, it's like they lay at my feet, oh, so you don't believe God exists? Well, explain how everything came from nothing, as if that's exactly what I believe, right? And then they will not hear me when I say that's not what I believe. They don't care. And so asking the question is always going to be better than just having somebody put out a label. A label is great shorthand, but if you want to actually have a conversation, you have to ask the questions. This is where the parenting comes in. If I want to understand what's going on in my kid's head, I'm not going to try to do a Cliff Notes version of it. I want to actually know. And the only way I can do that is by asking questions, sitting down and drilling down into the issue until they start to use their language in a way where we can compare and then unify our experiences. That's it. It's just have a conversation.
And that's exactly why I wanted to define how we think about these terms, because there are going to be other people who think about them entirely differently.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that anybody new to non-belief or coming from a religious perspective understands in that way, we don't speak for any other atheists other than ourselves.
Bingo.
And I think that's a great transition into our next topic.
Are we going to talk about the book?
We're going to talk about the book.
Yes. Oh my. Oh, so for everybody else out there, Moms has been telling me about this book. She read this thing. She put little sticky notes in it and has been talking to me about how we're going to talk about it for months now. And every time I bring it up, she's like, nope, we're going to save it for the podcast. This was before we started doing the podcast, mind you. This is a long time ago. So I have been looking forward to this for 6 months just so I can get it out of my head.
And this is a book written by another non-believer. I picked it up because it came up a lot in the online parenting groups I'm in for non-believers. So I was curious about it. It's called Relax, It's Just God, How and Why to Talk to Your Kids About Religion When You're Not Religious. And it's by Wendy Thomas Russell. And I think it's important to give a little bit of her background. The way she describes herself in the book is similar to you, Pops.
Okay.
She lost her belief after going to college, and it was just kind of a gradual process for her.
Okay.
And then at some point, she started calling herself an agnostic and then atheist-leaning agnostic. And she says, in the decade that followed, I didn't think much more about my views on faith. For a long time, I adopted a don't ask, don't tell policy. I didn't ask people about their beliefs, nor did I offer up my own. I married a man who shared my worldview, and beyond that, religion just didn't matter to me. I felt no need to make it a topic of conversation. That worked out great for about 13 years. Then something changed. I had a kid. And the start of this book was that she started writing a blog about being a parent who wasn't a believer. And it led to this book. So hearing the topic of the book, how and why to talk to your kids about religion when you're not religious, what would you think some of the top concerns of parents would be about this topic?
When you say concerns, are you talking about concerns like socially about teaching their kids this way? Or are you talking about concerns as in topics they would want to cover with their children that they felt that religion has an easy answer to, but secularism might not? Like, so, what does that mean?
Thinking about non-believing parents talking to their kids about God.
Right.
What are some of the reasons that you think parents would have concerns and want to pick up a book to discuss it?
It depends on where the parent is coming from, right? Like if you've never been a believer ever, like you were raised in an atheist household and your parents didn't really ever discuss religion with you. And so as such, you don't have like a super clear understanding of how religious practices work or the differences between religions, or even more important, sometimes the differences in denominations or sects of a religion. You might have questions about, based on where I live, this is the religion that my kids are going to be exposed to. What specifically do I need to look out for when the kids come home talking about God? Friends at school would be an issue in that regard. Teachers proselytizing when they shouldn't would be an issue in that regard. But beyond that, just maybe a basic understanding of what, theists mean when they're talking about their religion. Because again, asking questions, finding common ground, that's where it has to start. It has to start from a position of empathy. Otherwise, you're just talking at people or like warning your kids about some religious boogeyman.
So on her blog, she asked other parents what their biggest concerns were. Actually, one of the ones you brought up is she lists the top 10. And one of the ones you brought up is number 10, religious literacy, limited knowledge of religion or religious stories. Let me read you the first 9 that she lists. Number 1, indoctrination, not knowing how to be honest without indoctrinating kids into one way of thinking. 2, language, fear of saying something to their children that would be repeated in mixed company. 3, family, having to contradict religious family members while trying to keep peace in the family. 4, age appropriateness, not knowing what's age appropriate for children to hear.
Oh, the Bible, full of so many age inappropriate passages.
I mean, that's my take. I'm curious if that's what these parents are thinking about. 5, resentment, keeping their own negative experiences or resentment out of conversations with their children.
That's a good one.
6, death, facing conversations about death without the comforts of heaven or an afterlife. 7, tolerance, separating the idea of religious tolerance from the idea of tolerating religious hatred or abuse. 8, confusion, fear of confusing a child. 9, belief, fear that if a child hears about religion, she or he might start believing it.
So much of that comes down to delivery, though, just like with anything, talking with a kid. If you make it a conversation and you stay calm as a parent, then your kids will keep asking questions and you keep giving them compassionate and measured answers. It's more likely, in my experience as a parent and a teacher at least, that you're going to end up with the kid understanding more about the possibilities, not even trying to make them view it the same way you do, but that they're not going to have that fear of the unknown anymore. Specifically, let's start with the fear of death, if you don't mind.
Yeah. And actually, I think death for all parents, religious, non-religious, is a topic the parents are concerned about talking with their kids about.
Yeah. And where'd Rover go? Rover went over the Rainbow Bridge, honey.
And we might have a whole episode about it. I will say that section of the book about talking with kids about death is by far the best in the book. And that might be why it gets recommended so much. I frankly can't remember all the questions that came up. But what I found interesting about this list is that it, to me, does not mention that second thing you brought up. Because
what was the second thing that I brought up? I have a memory of a goldfish.
What if, friends or teachers or outside society tells our kids something negative about being non-believers?
Well, that's part of indoctrination, though, isn't it?
Oh, but that's not what this is talking about.
Okay. This
indoctrination is from non-religious parents not knowing how to be honest without indoctrinating kids into their way of thinking.
I think that's something that everybody should be concerned with, not just non-believers. But yes, that's right. I understand better. Okay, yes.
And I understand, but I think it's super interesting that the other version, the one we're talking about, is never mentioned. I don't think a single one of these concerns is about protecting our ideas about non-belief. Mm-hmm. It's all about protecting religious people from our non-belief.
That's weird.
So it's kids' indoctrination. We want to make sure we don't indoctrinate our kids with our non-belief. Language, we don't want our kids to say something in mixed company. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, okay, I understand both sides of this. And I know not every conversation needs to have a both sides guy, but I'm going to be the both sides guy here.
Yeah.
Like we said, or like I said in last episode, one of the things that I liked about that TikTok Christian guy, the dad, was that, he allowed for his child to be a child. He did not leave his beliefs for his child, but he did not necessarily chastise the child for theirs. And so when our kids bring up non-belief with family members, I think, yes, they should feel confident in the relationship with those family members that they can talk about these things without prejudice or punishment. But also they need to understand that there are certain ways that you can talk about these things that promote a civil discussion, rather than flatly, bluntly saying something that, whether or not they believe it's true, is undeniably the wrong rhetorical choice for promoting civility in a conversation. So I think it's like with curse words, like Go, our youngest, is growing into be an absolute artisan of inventing his own curse words. He's going to be a Rembrandt of profanity when he grows up, I believe. But he also has never had his teachers come to us and say, oh, he's saying this, that, or the other thing in the classroom, please help him stop, because time and place matters. So I think that is definitely something that you need to talk to your kids about, regardless of how you're talking to them about religion. That, yes, if we're going to be a society where we're going to be coexisting with people who disagree with us, I do think that civil conversation is best served by knowing how to be civil in a conversation, and that certain words, phrases, phraseology don't promote that. Sorry for the long-winded explanation.
No, and I completely agree. But I do just think it's interesting that the opposite side of it is barely mentioned.
Yeah.
So going from there, she goes to a section called Our Most Common Follies. Mm-hmm. She brings up a researcher, Crystal J. Manning, who is a college professor, a mother, and a non-believer. And she did the country's first academic study into non-religious parenting. She talks.
When was this study done? Do you know?
Sounds like between 2005 and 2007.
Okay.
So, not too bad.
Rise of the Tea Party.
Yeah.
The Audis were definitely a time when the religious tenor of the country was changing. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. And this study was done in the US, or was it a global study?
This study, as far as I know, was done in the US.
Okay. So sorry, I don't want to derail the conversation, but I think I'm always curious, not the study's results, but the study's methodology and data set.
Exactly.
Okay. So sorry, keep going.
She talks about how Manning identified 5 strategies parents employ when incorporating religion in the lives of their children. And this is, just to be clear, parents who are not believers. So for parents who are not believers, she identified 5 strategies of how they incorporate religion into their children's lives. Okay. So I'm going to read straight from the book. Some parents, she said, went right back to embracing the religion of their youths, presumably for the sake of the children. Others joined alternative religious organizations, such as the Unitarian Universalist Church, which touts spiritual guidance in a community setting without the dogma of traditional belief systems. A third group engaged in what Manning called outsourcing. They enrolled their children in, say, Hebrew school or Catholic catechism classes while remaining non-religious at home. A fourth group took it upon themselves to provide religious instruction at home, although she noted most of these parents felt they had been unsuccessful at doing so.
Mm-hmm.
But by far, the most common approach, she said, was the fifth, absolute silence. When it comes to religion, Manning told me a large number of parents completely ignore it. Now, I'd have to read the study to be sure. None of this is about talking about non-belief.
Right.
But I think it's because this is a survey about incorporating religion, right? So that wouldn't be covered by this. But then Wendy Thomas Russell goes on to say, there is a sixth approach as well, one that Manning didn't touch upon in her study. Some parents, mostly militant atheists, indoctrinate their kids against religion by teaching them, to the exclusion of most other messages, that religion is not a valid worldview and should not be taken seriously. So this brought up a couple thoughts for me.
Mm-hmm.
One, I thought it was super interesting that the most common approach was silence.
Yeah.
That seems wild to me, but as part of the whole conversation about all atheists not being the same,
mm-hmm.
I think this is maybe one of the areas where you and I are very similar, but different than other people. Because I would say both of us love digging into big conversations, big topics. You know, if kids see something from another tradition and ask about it, we're like, yeah, let's talk about that. This is what the story is about.
I mean, like if we're talking about conversations, like not every kid is going to have the inclination to have those sorts of discussions. That's not a universal experience for every family. And so I can understand, like for some families, if the kids don't want to ever talk about it, no matter what the parents do to help like demonstrate the value in discussing these sorts of things, if the kids aren't ready or willing to have those conversations, then that makes the conversations really hard to have. They're not going to care. They're not going to engage. And at the end of the day, the parents might just get frustrated and give up and say, you know, why? I mean, ultimately, if they come to it on their own, they'll come to it on their own, whether or not we discuss it. And I already know what my beliefs are. I've already told them what my beliefs are. And so they at least know where the family stands from the parenting side of things. So if they don't want to talk about this stuff with us, fine, let's move on. There are all sorts of different reasons I could think of, including that one, why silence might end up being, even if it doesn't start off being, might end up being the response.
I've heard from some parents a fear that if they taught their kids about religion, it would be making them religious.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've talked to people who believe that. Yeah, for sure.
And that is just never something that occurred to me. And yeah, it's really funny because when my mom listened to our first episode, the one comment she had was, but you did grow up in a religious household. And in her perspective, that was because we did talk about all the religions. I mean, we didn't talk about Muslim beliefs very much, but we read all the stories from Christianity. We read all the stories from Judaism. You know, those were very much a part of this fabric of the household growing up. But none of them were presented as an absolute truth. Right. Or something to be believed. And frankly, I think the best way, without telling kids anything, to make it clear that all of these stories are part of human sort of myth and storytelling is to just read all of them. Yeah. But it was interesting to see that as a concern and to see that as a concern among some parents because it was just not something that ever occurred to me to be nervous about.
It also makes me circle back to what we were talking about before in this episode about language, labels and usage, and your mom using the word religious in a way that didn't comport with your usage of the word religious. So she said religious, and you had to drill down on what she meant. Because otherwise you would hear religious, you'd be like, no, we didn't go to temple. We didn't go to, we didn't go to any religious services, expecting to have some sort of like specific relationship with the divine. We just read the stories. And then your mom says, oh yeah, that's what I meant. But it isn't until you actually have a conversation that you realize that that's what the person means.
This year, I read the boys the story of Passover, which is one of my favorites from growing up. It's just so damn metal.
It really is.
The river's turning to blood, the sky turning black. I just think
God hardening Pharaoh's heart so Pharaoh would not accept God's sovereignty on purpose. So he would then have an excuse. Sorry, I'm getting on the soapbox. Anyway, moving on. Yes, you were saying?
Yeah. So this was this was one of our favorite stories to tell. And every year we would try to see if we could remember all the plagues before reading the story. Right. Yeah. So it was just like a favorite. And, I do.
The Pentateuch. It is brutal.
So, I want the boys to know about some of these stories kind of in the same way I did. Also, it's weird, on the whole Jewish front, I've thought a lot about it because they are Jews,
right?
Even though we're secular. And I've done a lot of reading. I'm sort of fascinated by the experience of kids who are adopted and who grow up in that situation. And what you hear a lot, particularly from adoptees of color, is that it's very hard dealing with racism if they grew up with white parents because they weren't prepared for it.
Interesting.
And the discussions weren't had in the family.
Oh, yeah.
In the same way.
Okay.
And so I am sort of conscious, even though we're not going to raise the kids in the Jewish faith, they may still experience anti-Semitism.
For sure.
And so I want them to have some sense of that community and identity, because I think that is important, particularly when that identity might be attacked in some way. So
for sure, even
though I'm not religious, there are a lot of things I love about the Jewish community. And when I see people railing against Jews, I know the beauty of that community that I was raised in. And it gives me a sense of self against that, if that makes any sense at all. So totally. I do care about them knowing about it a little bit. And so we're reading it and I'm going through all the plagues and they're kind of interested. And then I get to the birth of the death of the firstborn.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this one's a little bit rough, guys. And I tell them about it. And without missing a beat, Go says, but I thought God was good.
And so we get to the problem of evil without getting to the problem of evil.
Yeah. Just as an example, that reading kids about religion, that does not, I don't think people have to be scared about that. And we talk a lot about complex characters. And I was just like, yep, God's complex, dude. God is way complex. So anyways, I thought that was interesting. But then I think it's really interesting that the author jumps in with that final example and that she calls it militant atheists.
Yeah, that's weird.
I am just wondering, how is that more militant than the first example of embracing the religions of their youth, which, though they might go to great churches, those religions are going to tell their kids that religion is the correct religion. Right?
Right. I also think it's, okay, sorry, keep going.
So that is going to be the experience of those children. They're going to be part of a church that tells them that the religion that they are learning is the right one. And that is the most valid worldview. and that other worldviews are not.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not called militant. This is a book for parents who are non-believers. And with all those laid out, there is no addition of a version of teaching kids about non-belief with a positive connotation.
That's weird.
And I was just like, what? And this is when I started to think, like, what is happening?
What's the purpose of the book? I know that's what the stated purpose of the book is, but like people come at non-belief, like everybody knows, people come to non-belief from all sorts of different paths, right? So if somebody had an upbringing where in a really devout family and had profoundly negative experiences through their family or through their church community or whatever, then they're going to perhaps be a little bit more strident in helping their kids understand how or necessarily religion can be harmful, right? It's like I don't understand how you can look at this book as a non-believer and come away with anything other than this is a person's opinion.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I think that's what I found so surprising. Because when I think about a book about parenting for parents who are non-believers,
mm-hmm.
I think I assumed that there was going to be a lot of support for ways to present that worldview
mm-hmm.
in a positive light.
Okay.
So
yeah, that makes sense.
I would say, to me, probably the biggest crux of this book
mm-hmm.
is that first point that she brings up, how not to indoctrinate your children into non-belief. And we're running kind of long. So I think, like I said, this is probably going to go for a couple of episodes.
Sure.
But
I think we should make indoctrination its own episode, because there's so much that happens with that in and around it.
Yeah.
We could easily talk about that for an hour.
But I think what I'd like to talk about, following up on this is, well, I'm not sure. What
It's big.
It's big.
It's big and it's nuanced and it's really easy as a parent to feel like you're doing right by your child, but in the end, you're restricting their choices. You're imposing your worldview. And I think no parent necessarily, well, that's not true. A lot of parents that I've talked to, whether they're theists or atheists, don't seek to do that. They seek to be more even-handed. But I know some definitely seek to, because they feel like, not doing so is immoral. Not teaching your children that religion is evil is an immoral thing to do to your children. Not teaching your children that homosexuality is a sin and that not being in heaven is the worst thing that could ever happen in eternity. That is a moral decision. And so people are approaching it from a moral decision, doing what they think is right for their children. It's really fraught. So yeah, I would love to dig into that over the course of a whole episode.
Because what this book really made me think is, I don't want to indoctrinate our kids,
mm-hmm.
but I also think sharing your beliefs
mm-hmm.
and how you think about the world
right.
is one of the funnest, most rewarding parts of being a parent. So,
well, it's necessary.
Yeah. But where is that ground? Right. That's what I'm missing. Can I just read you one section? One more section, please. And then we'll head out.
Yeah. Sure.
Because this is when I start to like, is there not a middle ground? So she writes, does this mean that we don't have a duty to tell our kids facts, or that we need to be so sensitive to religion that we put creationism and evolution on the same level? No, not at all. Absolutely tell your child about how the world works. Tell him everything you know about science, but then allow him to do with that information what he likes. Getting back to the earlier question, it would be weird and quite puzzling if knowing all she does about the earth, Maxine, who's the author's daughter,
Mm-hmm.
had chosen to believe the world was flat. But there would have been no reason to stress over it either. That particular belief doesn't hurt anyone. Really?
Yeah, I'm going to leave that floating out there like a red balloon.
Except that you don't understand how days work?
There's that's a little weird, and promoting flat Earth doesn't help humanity.
I mean,
but regardless.
Yeah. So that's what, because, I want to support our kids in discovering the world and thinking about it and coming to their own conclusions.
Right.
But I would like them to understand why the sun rises.
Well, I think what it comes down to is what is falsifiable and what is unfalsifiable. Flat Earth is a falsifiable proposition. It is falsifiable in so many ways that to attach yourself to a negative belief that's why it's considered a conspiracy theory, right? Because it's not a logical position to take because of the fact that it's a falsifiable proposition, A, and B, anybody can falsify it, right? But when it comes to unfalsifiable beliefs, like beliefs about, like religious beliefs, and I know you will have people that'll say, oh, but of course you can falsify my assertion that God exists because of this, that, or the other thing, because of a philosophical argument, or because of, my feelings about, like, whatever they say is evidence, they're going to think is evidence. Personally, I believe that theological claims are not falsifiable. That's where they get their power, but that's their chief problem. And as such, that's where that indoctrination is tough, because you're not talking about something that can be defeated through a wider array of data, through facts and through logic, because then it becomes an emotional situation, But again, I think that's a whole episode that's going to be really fascinating to drill into.
Yeah. So I think the next thing we'll talk about in the next episode is kind of building on what I was talking about talking to kids about religion. Mm-hmm. There's a section about kickstarting religious literacy. So
okay.
I think
that'll be fun. Yeah.
So kind of how to read religious stories with kids, and then some other stuff. So that's coming up.
Fun.
As we mentioned on the last episode, we'd love for listeners to send in their parenting stories.
Please, we want to hear them. We have weird ones too.
We just got the last episode up, so it actually looks like a couple people are listening. Oh my gosh.
We love you so all.
Much. But definitely not enough to get any sort of responses. So we don't have one for this week.
Be the first. Be brave. Be courageous. Be the first.
Whatever it is, like questions or things you felt you did great or weird things that happened. Yeah, we would just love to hear it. So our email address is in the show notes, and you can email us a story or send us a voice memo if you're not scared of people hearing your voice. But it would be great to hear from you.
Yes. And remember, guys, we're trying to build a community here. This isn't just us talking into the ether, ideally. This is us having a conversation with you guys and hearing what you have to say, hearing your thoughts on our shows, hearing your thoughts on your lives, because we're all in this together. Like, not to put too fine of a point on it, but you've heard me say now over the course of 2 episodes, I'm a utilitarian. I'm a consequentialist. I firmly believe that as social creatures, we have an obligation to each other. And part of that is understanding where each other comes from. We are atheists. If you are also atheists, but you totally disagree with how we've presented a topic or our conclusions, then we would love to hear that, because ultimately your view might better inform ours, which could then lead us to learning something that helps our children. So from a purely selfish standpoint, please tell us where we're wrong. Tell us where you agree. Tell us how you do it differently, but talk to us. We want to hear it from you.
So I think that's it. A quick shout out. The music for this show was provided by First Frame Music by Jonathan Zalben. Thank you so much.
And so that wraps up another episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.